So in this video we're talking about the regulation of breathing, and we need to think about the nervous system to understand this. So let's think about the brain first of all. Brain's essentially a bit like a boxing glove. This is the top part of the brain, the cerebrum. This would be the temporal lobe, the occipital, the frontal, the parietal in the middle. Now at the front there's an area called the brain stem here. This is the brain stem. And behind this there's an area called the cerebellum. And the brain stem is continuous with the spinal cord. This is looking at the brain from the side. And the part we're interested in particularly in this talk is the brain stem, and it's in three areas. The top part of the brain stem is the midbrain. The middle part of the brain stem is the pons. The bottom part of the brain stem that's continuous with the spinal cord is the medulla oblongata. Now the part of the brain we're particularly interested in this talk, as we say, is the brain stem. So let's think about that now in a little more detail. So we have the brain stem here, and the first part, as we said, is the midbrain. Then the pons bows out a bit there, and then we have the medulla oblongata just there, that's continuous with the spinal cord. So on this diagram, let's just sort of demarcate that a bit. So this top part here would be midbrain, this middle part here would be pons, and this bottom part here is medulla oblongata. So let's now put on the parts that are relevant to the regulation of respiration and the breathing process. Well, the first part is in the upper part of the pons here. This area here that we're drawing in blue. So this is the blue area. And this is called the pneumotaxic area. The pneumotaxic area of the brain. And then beneath that we'll draw in orange, still in the pons. Another area just there, and that area is called the apneustic area in the pons. But then we get down to the medulla oblongata, and somewhat more interesting bits really. Here there's a long sort of nucleus. Now just before we go on, I want to point out what's what here. This is dorsal. So this is the back. This is the back that we're drawing here, and this is the front that we're drawing here. So that's the back and the front. So dorsal, of course, is posterior, the back, and the front is ventral, or anterior, just so we're orientated. So we see that this respiratory part, these respiratory neurons here, this nuclei is a collection of nerve cells in the central nervous system. This is the dorsal group of neurons, and this is the primary inspiratory area. This controls breathing in. So this area here controls the process of inspiration. And as well as that, this area here is what we call the rhythmicity center. So most of the time when we're breathing, we're just breathing in, we're breathing out. It's just a normal rhythm. It's not particularly stimulated by changes in blood pH or anything like that, or increase in oxygen or decrease in oxygen, or increase in carbon dioxide or decrease in carbon dioxide. It's just a normal rhythm of breathing that just goes on all the time. So there's a normal rhythm of breathing. It's a bit like the heart. You know, the heart's got a pacemaker that spontaneously depolarizes to generate the heartbeat. It's a very similar situation with the respiratory system. So we just have this normal rhythmicity generated in this rhythmicity center, but it's also responsible for inspiration. And then once the nerve impulses have been generated, they go off and they go down the front of the spinal cord towards the respiratory muscles. But there's another area here in the medulla oblongata, just there, and this area is it used to be called the expiratory centre. So we used to think that this area was responsible for breathing in and this area was responsible for breathing out. But it's not quite that simple. This area in green is really an overdrive area. So when we want to move away from normal, regular tidal breathing when we're at rest, then this area kicks in and provides extra stimulation. But it remains true that this area here, this ventral area, this ventral nucleus, ventral respiratory nucleus, is responsible primarily for expiration as well. So what happens during normal quiet breathing here is this inspiratory area, because of its rhythmicity, because of the rhythms that built into it, sends about a 2-second burst of neurological stimuluses, neurological stimuli down the front of the spinal cord to the respiratory muscles to innervate the external intercostal muscles and the diaphragm, for the intercostal muscles to move up and out and the diaphragm to flatten downwards, as we've seen in previous videos. And that stimulating burst of neurological impulses lasts for about 2 seconds, and during that time inspiration will take place. So it's not really a sudden burst, it's a 2-second release of impulses that causes the process of inhalation. And then when this impulse stops, then the lungs just passively recoil. So it's normal for the ribs to go down and in. When the diaphragm relaxes, it flattens up the way. So there's normal expiration. It takes about 3 seconds, this passive recoil process. So in normal quiet breathing, you've got 2 seconds of neurological innervation there saying breathe in, and then it just stops. There's no innervation for about 3 seconds, and the passive recoil allows us to breathe out. So that's the situation here in the dorsal nuclei in quiet breathing. 2 seconds, diaphragm and intercostal muscles contract, and then passive recoil to breathe out. But if we are exercising or we are breathing more heavily, then this area here becomes involved, this ventral area becomes involved. So normally in quiet breathing, this is kind of sitting there doing nothing, the ventral area, but it will start functioning in deeper breathing during exercise. Now during exercise, inspiration is mostly stimulated by the dorsal area, but it will be to some extent stimulated by the ventral area in green as well. But this is primarily responsible for breathing out. So during exercise, this area is going to stimulate the diaphragm, as we know, but it's also going to stimulate the sternocleidomastoid muscles and the scalene muscles. Remember the accessory muscles of inspiration, and that's going to cause a forced, quicker inhalation to get more air in and out of the lungs. But during rapid breathing, during exercise, this ventral area is going to work as well. And that's going to stimulate the internal intercostal muscles to bring the ribs down in quicker, to increase the rate of expiration. And it's also going to contract some of the abdominal muscles that also helps with the expiratory or the exhalation process. And therefore we get forceful exhalation. And that will also send its nerve impulses down the front nerve route, down the ventral nerve route, to stimulate that process. So given that that's all going breathing in, breathing out quite nicely, even during exercise, what are these other bits for? Well, let's think about first of all the pneumotaxic area in blue. Now what this does is it soothes the transition between inhalation and exhalation. So we get a nice smooth transition. When we stop breathing in, we can breathe out. That kind of smooths that out. And what this area does is it sends inhibitory impulses to inspiratory areas at the end of inspiration. So it sends in inhibitory impulses. So in other words, there's impulses going from here down to here, like that. And when we've breathed in enough, it's going to say, stop breathing in now. So this area says breathe in, breathe in, breathe in, breathe in. And this area says, okay, you breathed in enough now, stop breathing in. So there's basically an inhibitory effect from the pneumotaxic centre down towards the inhalation area when it's time to stop breathing in. That means this pneumotaxic area shortens the duration of inhalation, and that prevents overexpansion of the lungs. But also, if it stops the inhalation process, activity from here is also going to increase the rate of breathing. Because if we stop breathing in fairly quickly, then we need to breathe again more rapidly after that. So increased activity from the pneumotaxic centre does inhibit the normal inhalation process. But it follows that increased activity in the pneumotaxic centre is going to increase the rate of respiration. So activity from the pneumotaxic centre will smooth out the transition between inhalation and exhalation. It will prevent overinflation of the lungs, and activity from here will also increase the rate of ventilation. So we'll get increased rate of ventilation. And if there's a lot of activity in the pneumotaxic centre, the patient can breathe very quickly. They'll have tachypnea, and the rate can increase to 30 or 40 a minute. But if there's reduced activity from here, then the ventilatory pattern will slow down. There'll be less breaths per minute. So basically this pneumotaxic area is controlling respiratory rate and frequency. So a strong signal from here, inhibiting the end of inhalation at the inhalation centre, can mean that inhalation only lasts for about 0.5 of a second. But if the pneumotaxic centre is not doing very much and we're not getting this inhibitory effect, then inhalation can last for about 5 seconds. So we see it's exerting this smoothing out and controlling influence on this area here in yellow, this dorsal inspiration area, which I really like to think of as the main respiratory area, but it's influenced by other areas of the brain. So that brings us on to the apneustic area here, still in the pons. And this also plays a role in transition. It smooths out the transition again between inhalation and exhalation. This area in the lower pons just here, the apneutic area. And this also sends impulses down to the inhalation centre. But it's kind of doing the opposite of this one. Some people say they're antagonistic, but actually I prefer to think of them more as being balanced. So what the apneustic area will do is it will stimulate the inhalation centre, making inhalation longer. So this one, the pneumotaxic centre, makes inhalation shorter. This one, the apneutic centre, makes inhalation longer. So it gives us longer, deeper inspirations. Take longer, deeper breaths of air. So you can kind of see these two balancing out. This one is going to prevent inhalation. This one's going to stimulate it. This one, the pneumotaxic area, is going to make breathing shorter and faster. This one's going to make breathing deeper and longer. And the relevant activity of these is going to give, as most of the time, a normal pattern of inhalation and exhalation that responds to the metabolic demands of the body at the time. And there is actually an abnormal pattern of breathing called apneusic breathing. So this is normal in physiology, of course. It's the balance that makes the normal pattern. It's kind of a homeostasis, really. But apneusic respirations are abnormal, deep, gasping inhalations with a pause at full inhalation, which is unusual. There's a pause at full inhalation. So in apneusic breathing, the lungs are overinflated, but that's an abnormal condition. But it does illustrate how this is functioning under normal circumstances. Now, most of the factors which are altering respiratory rate and pattern of respiration are acting on this primary yellow area here in the dorsal nuclei, in what we've been calling the inspiratory area. Now, if we start exercising, let's imagine that's an arm bone there and a radius and ulnar there with a hand on the end. could be a foot, of course. If we start exercising, what we're doing is we're using a lot of muscular activity. So the muscles, in that case the bicep, and round here the tricep, are going to become very metabolically active. We're going to get muscle movement and contraction. And within these muscles there are proprioceptors. Within the muscles and joints there are proprioceptors. Now, we normally think of proprioceptors as giving us information about the position of the muscles and the position of the joints, and that's absolutely true, they do. But also, when the muscles start to be used vigorously, these proprioceptors from the muscles, the skeletal muscles of the body, will send information to the primary respiratory area here. They will stimulate that area. Now, if we exercise, if we go out for a run, or we're chopping down a tree or doing vigorous activity, then what's going to happen is the oxygen in the body is going to go down, the carbon dioxide is going to go up. And of course that means we need to breathe more deeply to get more oxygen in, to get more carbon dioxide out. But these proprioceptors anticipate that. This is anticipated by the proprioceptors. And they send the impulses to this area saying, well, I've started exercising now, we've started a bit of a workout. That means we're going to be going low on oxygen really soon. The carbon dioxide is going to be going up really soon. Why don't you get breathing straight away to supply me with the oxygen I need to get rid of the carbon dioxide I don't need? And that's what happens. So when you start exercising, you'll start hyperventilating, breathing faster, breathing deeper, before the oxygen goes down and before the carbon dioxide goes up. It's an anticipatory mechanism. And not only that, the areas in the brain that control these muscles, in what's called the primary motor cortex, in the frontal lobe of the brain, that will send messages to this area saying, look, I've just given instructions to the leg muscles and the arm muscles to start working hard, so why don't you start breathing quicker now, to anticipate this increased metabolic demand that's going to come about. So partly it's stimulated by the proprioceptors, partly it's stimulated by the areas of the brain that control these muscles, giving this area an early warning, what might be called a bit of a heads up, saying this is going to happen. But of course we can control breathing with the brain as well, with the upper part of the brain, with the conscious brain. And we can say, well, I think I'll hold my breath for a while now. So we can send impulses from the brain via control of the will to this area as well, and saying, okay, stop breathing now, hold your breath. There's poisonous fumes about, or we're going to swim underwater, or whatever it is. So there is this degree of voluntary control as well. We can temporarily suspend the breathing process by impulses going from the upper part of the brain down to that inspirational area as well. And also up here in the brain we have the hypothalamus, and we have areas in the brain called the limbic system, and these are responsible for controlling emotion. So there's impulses from these limbic and hypothalamic areas of the brain as well that also go down to this area, this primary respiratory inhalation area in the dorsal aspect of the medulla oblongata. So when you're anxious, that's going to cause increased in breathing. But of course other emotions, laughing is going to alter the respiratory pattern, crying is going to alter the respiratory pattern, and these are regulated by impulses coming from the limbic areas of the brain, again to this respiratory centre in the dorsal part of the medulla oblongata. Now when there's normal quiet breathing just controlled by the rhythmicity centre in this inspiratory area, the body needs about 200 mils of oxygen per minute just to fulfill its normal metabolic demands. So at the moment you're probably using about 200 mils of oxygen per minute in the body. And when we're breathing normally at a normal quiet rate, that's called eupnea. Eupnea. Just normal breathing. And the converse of this is dyspnea, how we pronounce that, dyspnea, difficulty in breathing or abnormal breathing. So this is giving us about 200 mils a minute during normal quiet eupnea, normal quiet breathing. And that's absolutely fine. But then when we're exercising, instead of 200 mils a minute, this is going to go up dramatically, and we might need 10, 15, 20 times more oxygen in the body, up to 3 or 4 litres a minute of oxygen required by the metabolizing body cells. Or if you're some super duper Olympic athlete and you can exercise very, very heavily, extreme exercise, then you might be using 30 times more oxygen than normal. So how are these changes in rate accounted for? How does this know? Well, we have mentioned that partly we get information from the proprioceptors, but during extreme exercise this is not enough. And what happens during extreme exercises is we get impulses, as we see here, from the peripheral nervous system. Now, when there's a lack of oxygen in the body, that's detected by the peripheral nervous system, and that will increase activity in this primary respiratory centre. So lack of oxygen is going to stimulate this centre from peripheral receptors. But there's also another group of receptors, and these are called central receptors, that are in and around the medulla oblongata itself. And these medullary sensors don't detect a decrease in the amount of oxygen. What they do is they detect an increase in the amount of carbon dioxide and the amount of acid in the blood and tissue fluids. So as you might know, if there's an increase in the amount of carbon dioxide in the tissue fluids and in the blood, the carbon dioxide, when the carbon dioxide combines with the water in the body fluids, so CO2 plus H2O, what that does is, you probably know this, it gives us a reversible reaction. And this reversible reaction produces carbonic acid. Carbonic acid. That is the carbonic acid. And what happens is, once the carbonic acid is formed, it can dissociate into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. That's so hydrogen ions there and bicarbonate ions there. This is actually an equilibrium. There's actually a chemical equilibrium here. So all the time the carbon dioxide and the water are forming the carbonic acid, and it's actually going back again. But that means there's always going to be some carbonic acid here, and that's going to release the hydrogen ions here. Now, what is an acid? An acid is something that produces hydrogen ions in solution. So the more hydrogen ions there are, the lower the pH will be. Let's say that again. The more hydrogen ions there are, the lower the pH will be. In other words, more hydrogen ions is going to make it become more acidic. And this is what the medulla is sensitive to. So when there's an increase in carbon dioxide, there's going to be more hydrogen ions, and the medulla is going to be sensitive to that, and it's going to respond by increasing respiratory rate. Because when there's more hydrogen ions, it knows there's more carbon dioxide, so it increases ventilatory rate to get rid of the carbon dioxide. So the peripheral nervous system tells us about the decrease in oxygen. The central nervous system here, the medullary receptors, tell us about the increase in hydrogen ions and the increase in carbon dioxide. This is why you might have heard of something called Kussmaul's ventilation, which occurs in, for example, diabetic ketoacidosis. So in DKA, there's an acidosis, diabetic ketoacidosis. So that means there's more hydrogen ions here. And these hydrogen ions in an acidotic patient will also stimulate the ventilatory effort, explaining why we get the deep breathing and the ventilatory changes associated with acidosis. So what we can say is the medulla oblongata is able to detect the hypercapnia, the hypercarbia, with the associated increase in hydrogen ions, and is able to generate a respiratory response to that, to blow them off, to reduce the carbon dioxide.